Bill has has had many different positions over the years, but just to name two: meteorologists in charge at Houston, and of course the previous director of the National Hurricane Center. We were very excited. We've been excited about this meeting all year, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Bill Reid.
We actually met we did this at the Birmingham area last summer for the various schools that have meteorology over there. I've done Penn State, and where else did I do this? Of course at A&M and at the University of Houston. I have several talks I give, but I couldn't make up my mind which one I wanted to talk about. So what you're getting is a combination of three of the four that I usually blend in here. And since the one that everyone asks me to come back to the most on is a little bit about the career I had and how it might relate to some of the things you're doing. So the title of the first segment of my talk is 40 Years of Chasing Canes, but more appropriately it is how in the world did a C-plus high school student end up running the National Hurricane Center? I don't embellish any of this stuff, it's true, and if you really keep notes of as you go through your life and your career and you find these little kernels that no one else had and you start blending them together, you too, by the time you're my age, will have a story not too dissimilar from this. Now, my first note that I put in here that relates to my interest in hurricanes is tied to family. All my father's family were New Englanders, and I happen to actually have been born in New England, but obviously it was after 1938. Not much, 11 years, so still fresh in the memory. My father was in his senior year at the University of New Hampshire, chemical engineering, and he vividly recalled the big trees that was been wet the week before that. So the wind came up, the big trees full of foliage because it's still summer, not fall, and the trees are falling down all around the campus, and it actually wiped out the fraternity house he was living in from the trees down there. But perhaps the best experience that my family had with that storm is my great aunt was a secretary to the superintendent of Providence Schools. The Providence Schools office building was in downtown Providence, and anyone who's ever seen, and if you haven't seen it, you'll have to go look them up because it's really a dramatic picture. Providence is in the upper end of Narragansett Bay, nowhere near the beach. She went to work that morning. She didn't have a TV, didn't have a radio, and the paper she read was in the evening. So the weather forecast she got on the evening before she went to work that morning was talking about partly sunny and warm, maybe a shower later in the day. So she got on the bus in her summer clothes, went to work downtown Providence, fifth floor of this building in downtown on the square in Providence. And when the storm came in, the storm surge in Narragansett Bay was so high, it flooded downtown Providence. And she and everyone else there was looking out their window as what is going on. She had no idea what was happening. She could tell me to the day she died in her 90s exactly what she wore that day, how she went to work, what she ate, and how many days she lived in that building before she could get home to her house, which was perfectly high and dry some 10 miles north of downtown Providence. So I heard these stories of this storm all my life, back and forth from relatives. My actual first recollection of weather was a year before Hurricane Hazel. Any of you read about the Worcester tornado in Massachusetts? I was 4 years old. We lived in a place called South Weymouth, south of Boston, which was, if you look at the wind pattern from that, would have been directly downwind from about the 20,000 foot level on up from where Worcester was hit by the tornado. Now, I don't remember this per se, but I do remember constantly being told by my parents that I came running in. It was in the close to the evening. My father was home. I came running into the house saying, "Daddy, Daddy, how come it's snowing black?" And apparently it was like small debris, tar paper and stuff was falling over the area there downstream from the tornado. My first real experience with a hurricane was Hazel in October of '94. By then my father had taken a job with DuPont in Wilmington, Delaware. And we got a window broken by, still to this day, the strongest winds measured in Wilmington, Delaware's airport was from Hurricane Hazel. And the center of it was west of Washington, D.C. The storms tend to spread out their wind field as they move north and phase into an extratropical system on there, so the high winds can be far away from the center by the time they get in those latitudes. Hello. That's until Rita blew down the fence in my yard in Galveston County. I had not had any other damage from weather. At that time, almost 40-odd years of living in the Gulf Coast or severe weather zone in there. So when people tell you, you hear after that, I had no idea this could happen. I don't remember ever having any damage to my place. That's a true statement. They may be underestimating what their risk is, but for any one person, unless you live in Moore, getting hit by these kind of events is a rare event, sometimes a once-in-a-lifetime event. And that's one of our biggest challenges in getting people to respond like we think they should when we put out warnings for these events. And of course, I was told I stayed up watching this storm all night long as it came in. Other family members are cowering in the interior of the house. Is that familiar to any of you? When you were a kid? Next event that kind of pointed me towards a career in this racket that we all love was a nor'easter called Ash Wednesday storm. Anyone hear of that? It was in the news a lot during Hurricane Sandy because that had been, until Sandy, that was the benchmark storm surge flooding in the Delaware Bay, Jersey Shore regime, because they never had a hurricane coming from the Atlantic towards land on there to give them the kind of surges they saw with Sandy. And as you can see from those pictures, the damage pictures, this thing's not working any better than my laptop. What's the story here? The Sandy damage is exceeded by some 20% what the Ash Wednesday storm did. And there was a lot less population, of course, beachfront property and whatnot in '62 than there is now. Well, my father ended up being a trial. It became kind of a class action trial, federal court, civil suit on whether wind or water did the damage. Anybody heard about these kind of lawsuits when it comes to disasters? There's about 3 former Hurricane Center specialists that retired slightly before Hurricane Katrina that have made a ton of money working as forensic meteorologists on just those cases when there's a debate about houses that had damages, what caused it in there. Anyway, he'd come home every afternoon after the in-court session there and tell me about, because he knew by then I'm 12, I'm interested in weather, and talk about it with him from time to time. And he'd talk about the expert testimony with these guys with these hand-drawn maps on easels and their colored pencils and drawing on that. One of them was a local TV meteorologist. He actually was a PhD in physics, believe it or not, doing TV weather in Philadelphia. About that time, I was a typical middle school person. I could care less about school. I didn't want to study. I wanted to do sports and other stuff. And are you telling me, Dad, that I can get, that those guys are getting paid money to draw with colored pencils on paper? I'm in. My career's set. How do you think the court case went? Wind or water? Any idea? Man, you can tell you guys aren't coastal. You get in the coastal areas, it's water. It's always water. They had 50-mile-an-hour winds. Those houses wouldn't be destroyed like that by 50-mile-an-hour winds. It's the same story today. We have not changed our concept of building in harm's way very much in the history of this country, even though we say we do. How many of you knew you were interested in meteorology before you were 12? How many of your friends that want to be lawyers like that? Proctologists? Right. Well, you know, I've come up with a theory on that. I mean, this is, every time I ask it, it's more like 80 or 90% of us really did know what, we were pretty much on the track by the time we were 12. My son's a liberal arts guy. He's 30 years old. He still doesn't know what he wants to do. I have no way of counseling him because I just don't get it. But here's the problem. I've been studying this genetic stuff. Our double helixes somehow got twisted at birth. So that explains it, I'm pretty sure. Effective gene theory of meteorology. I really was a C+ student. I was the class media in my class. These are the only 2 pictures in in the high school yearbook the year I graduated with me. The only other thing I was noted for I'm not really proud of, I managed to go out at lunch every day just off the school grounds and have cigarettes with my buddies and never got suspended for it. But I could play pretty decent. I still enjoy it. I think I applied at 13 schools. They were every school I knew about that had a meteorology department. I sent an application in for. And as you might imagine, with the C+ average, the letters that came back rather quickly, I might add, said, I don't think you quite meet our standards for a state student. Nice polite way saying you're too stupid to do this. Then I get the letter back from Texas A&M. Accepted. No ifs, ands, buts, no requirement to go to summer school, prove your college material, or anything like that. And part of it had to do with the fact that it had just changed from being a college, to which I would add, once I got there from growing up in the Northeast, I said, oh my God, it's the last bastion of the Confederacy. You look at that place. Does that look like a typical college campus? It's black and white, but it looks the same in color. A general, of all things, a general had been named the president of the school, and he had vision. He said, this place will go nowhere unless it becomes a full university, becomes co-ed, and grows the meat of their core with top-notch faculty members, and he did it. He made it happen. You can see it now, how big it is. But it was all male then. There's no cable TV back in 1967. How many of you know what a dry county is? Wow. See, it's a different world. I grew up in Delaware where everybody drank. My father worked as a bartender on the side. I didn't think anything of it. I heard this dry county. Well, yeah, it looks pretty dry here. It was dry. I think the statute of limitations is gone. I had a wonderful invitation on my Delaware driver's license, and I looked older than 18. Therefore, I was the go-to guy to go on Friday night and drive to the next county that wasn't dry and pick up the beer. And that was the extent of social life there. It actually benefited me. I didn't know how to study, so I learned how to study because, what the hell, there's nothing else to do. Same thing on the Braddock. I won the lottery. You know what the lottery was like back then? How much it paid? They had a draft lottery. Thing known as you guys have to still register for a draft, right? Or has that even been done away with? But back then it was real. And I won the 1969 draft lottery. The prize was $840, all expense paid trip in the U.S. Navy. And I got lucky because back then it was the way the Navy did it. They assigned you into whether you'd be enlisted or an officer based on grades. If you were a 2.0 to a 3.0, you went in enlisted and they tried to get your way into officer. 3.0 and above were officers. I had a 3.5. And they needed meteorologists. So not only did I go in as an officer, they guaranteed me I'd work as a meteorologist while in there. It was hard to beat. I actually got, I didn't have to worry about what to wear every day. It was from 7 months of the year, it was khaki. The other 5, it was blue. It's real simple. You just pull them out of the closet and get dressed. And then we got luckier in that they had a whole bunch of people. They used to fly hurricanes in the Navy and typhoons. They had 2 squadrons, one in the Pacific, one in the Atlantic. And the Atlantic squadron, of the 8 meteorologists they had, 4 of them had just flunked their physicals. And here it is, and this was like in October. I was still being in training at the time, and 71, and they basically were scrambling to get people as a volunteer. They wouldn't make people fly into hurricanes, but it was volunteer. And they asked me would I like to fly into hurricanes out of Jacksonville, Florida. I was already programmed to go to Guam, the Fleet Forecast Center in Guam, which was huge back then to support the aviation and fleet into Vietnam. And that's really where I wanted to go. I'd be immersed in tropical meteorology, do my 4 years there, and really know what I was doing. So I didn't mind the idea of Guam, but the idea of flying into hurricanes was really intriguing. Wow, it's like Six Flags, and they're going to pay me, And they did. They paid you an extra $100 a month to fly into hurricanes. You won't remember any storm, but perhaps this one. Hurricane Agnes was the only storm that hit the U.S. that did any significant impact of the flooding in Pennsylvania, downstate New York, and in the Appalachians was record-setting in most cases, killed a lot of people and did a lot of damage, and it was all from basically a Sandy-like occurrence where it got captured by a late season front in June, everything on the weaker side of it. In fact, if you look at the S-shaped track there, and if you were just to jiggle it a little bit southeastward, it would look like Sandy's track. Of course, it wasn't as big and not as strong. We flew these storms in the Navy because partly we didn't know any different, and partly because we had sensors at the time that were the first really good sensors at measuring. We were experimenting with wave height, but the thing we were measuring pretty good now was sea surface temperature. And if you look at your history of satellites, that was when some of the key research on retrieval of sea surface temperature from satellite data was being undertaken in there. So we were gathering data that was useful for many purposes because they were still working on some of the fueling theories on hurricane energy from the heat transport from the ocean, and of course water temperature was one of the key things they wanted to look at. So we fly in below the clouds. We go down as low as 400 feet until the winds got to 75 knots, and as low as 800 feet at 100 knots. That was cool. The pilots hated it, but the meteorologists loved it, and we had control of the plane. When we say turn, they just turned the plane. That's how it worked back then. And it's rougher up high. You're not hitting convective updrafts and downdrafts. It's mechanical turbulence. So it's like you get on a washboard or a pothole road and gun your car down. Better is it's a P3, take a pickup truck and see what happens. You start doing a lot of this sort of thing. The end of an 8-hour flight, all you want to do is go to bed. You're so tired because your body involuntarily tries to adjust to the bumps. Whereas when you're flying up high, it's smooth as glass until you fly through especially the eye wall, especially one that's ingesting some dry air, and then the turbulence is ungodly. They hit several G's several times on one of those, and it's not too cool to do that in one of those planes. I also served in Keflavik, Iceland. I don't know who I upset. That is why they sent a tropical meteorologist to Keflavik, but it didn't last long. It was a cool place. Cold, actually. Then my last year was in Kingsville, Texas, where they train pilots. But at the hurricane job I had, here's where these things that you don't plan on that affect your later career kick in. Two of the guys that were writing advisories back then was then Director of the Hurricane Center, Bob Simpson, and his follow-on, who was fairly new to the game, Neil Frank. They're both still alive. Doc Simpson is 101. He's completely lucid. He remembers me. He was at the Tropical AMS conference a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now. He's confined to a wheelchair, and he saw me coming by, and he said, "Bill, over here." Okay, and by then I'd announced I was retiring, and he said, "You're too young to retire." Well, I'd done some research. Only one other director was older than I was at the time of retirement. I was coming up on 63. Bob Simpson was 60 when he retired. Because he said, "Why are you retiring?" So I returned the question, "Why did you retire?" I got fed up with Washington. Some things never change. Now, I wasn't fed up with Washington. Well, yes, I was, but that had been 10 years or more before that. Then I got to learn to just deal with it, I guess. But I had done 41 years. And the way the retirement system works, the way the pay scales are, I'm only going to make another nickel. And I'm a firm believer in a lot of these jobs that require a lot of thinking, a lot of change, and a lot of push, 5 years and out. I've seen so many people that hang on in leadership roles past their point of anything. They tried what they're going to try, and it's done, and then they sort of hang on doing the same thing over and over again. I'm that kind of person. So I told Louis Uccellini, who was my boss at the time when he hired me, he got me for 5 years, if you want me, and then I'm out of here. So that's why I left. It was cool. I also got to do this. I was the assistant outreach guy. They didn't call it that. It was the public affairs officer or something like that. They'd have something extra for you to do. So I was a legal officer, which meant I got to go down with shore patrol and bail the drunks out of the jail when they got in fights in bars. And I got to do things like this. And this is a picture of my first TV interview in Beaumont, Texas in 1973. and thick polyester suits. It's a Nomex flight suit. I was liking the dye from the heat out on the tarmac and the old-fashioned cameras and all that. But basically, the interview and the questions and the answers were no different from the stuff we try to do today to get people prepared for hurricane season. I got the script and everything from that. It's fascinating. It's hardly any difference at all. This really was the start of the hurricane awareness tours that we would ride the NOAA planes on around the coastline or the Air Force planes and make visits and get people excited about being ready for a hurricane. My Navy career, I was planning to go to graduate school on the Navy's ticket. That sounded good. They'll pay me to go to graduate school. Ain't going to happen. Vietnam was winding down, and they got rid of half of their weather officers. That is almost exactly what's happening today in DOD. They're cutting back because their budgets are cutting back from a wartime stance to a non-wartime stance. So I was out the door, and the only ones they kept were pilots who had gone into meteorology. They paid so much to train them, and academy graduates. They didn't touch that. So back to grad school, and a time-honored tradition of meteorology where you can't find a job. A reasonable way to go. After only 4.5 years, I come back to A&M. There's 25,000 students. There's a new building. It's co-ed, and the county's wet. Wow. And all I had to do was leave to get to that. Had a fun time doing my research thesis, using a lot of NASA data and learning how to write, and also learning that I don't want to do research because I don't like to write. Remember the C+? It was because of the C- is in English, not math. Didn't mind doing the research. Writing it up was not my bag. I really wanted to be a forecaster. I had that stuck in my craw that I had to be a forecaster. And really didn't do much of that in the Navy, so I managed to find a job in the U.S. Weather Service and started out on a test and evaluation lab, but I spent so little time there I don't have anything to really tell you about it other than it got me in the door, because right after I got there they asked me if I'd like to be a forecaster in San Antonio, and I said, well, gee, throw me in that briar patch. So off I went. And that's where the luck of the draw of my tropical career started kicking in. We had these big heavy rain flood events during the 6 years that I was there. And most of them were from weak decaying tropical cyclones that came in. We actually did a lot of case studies, worked with a guy that used to work at NSL, run the place up here, Bob Maddox. How many of you are familiar with that name? And some of the research he's done on heavy rain. And he worked with myself, Gary Bryce, and a guy called Jimmy Don Ward to come up with, at that time, mostly empirical techniques for forecasting the rainfall from these landfalling tropical storms. It worked pretty good, but these gargantuan rains that we had, that small period of time I was there, got me totally fascinated on the problem of dealing with the hurricane. Then we had Hurricane Allen in 1980. It looked like it was going to destroy Texas, and then a weekend right before landfall, made landfall on my birthday. I worked 7 straight day shifts. And back then, you punched out a punch tape of the forecast. I was a public desk. Back then, San Antonio covered from Beaumont, the Louisiana border, all the way to Brownsville, northward to Del Rio. Had Austin, San Antonio, and Houston metropolitan area. So your marine forecast was huge. You had to write it for the whole coastline. And of course, what was then the zone forecast, you had all these hurricane watches and warnings and stuff, and you're typing this stuff by hand. I loved every minute of it. It was war. And luckily, it pretty much fizzled out. It wiped out a whole bunch of mesquite trees and cattle on the King Ranch. And fortunately, the people had left the barrier islands down there because they were expecting the end of the world to occur, and it saved their lives because there's no protection down there. I came to Fort Worth to be a lead forecaster. Did 6 years of that. Probably the most noteworthy thing that happened while I was there is I was one of the few people I know that never had to buy a new roof while I lived there. That place gets hailed like it's going out of style. How many roofs did you guys get, Bill? Just one? You did pretty good. I got conned into going to National Weather Service headquarters. The regional director had told me nobody would be a manager in his region if they didn't go through either a regional office or headquarters. And that lovely building was what housed the Weather Service headquarters at the time. We figured it would probably be the 1,000th architectural wonder of the Soviet Union. It was horrible. It was not conducive for good work, but they had some really forward-thinking people running the show back then. And I don't know if we could pull off the modernization that we pulled off 20-odd years ago with the political and budgetary setup that currently faces our country, but we pulled it off then. A lot of good stuff came out of that. I worked Hurricane Hugo there. There was a handful of us that they had. We actually worked a phone bank, and there was a direct link between the House and Senate member offices, and they could call for updates on what the hurricane was going to do. And a lot of what transpired that helped us came on the backing of Senator Hollings. That name probably rings a bell. Some of you have been on these Hollings. He became a big friend of the Weather Service on the forecasts and advice he was getting from us during Hurricane Hugo, and he was a very respected senator, and it really helped a lot in the succeeding years in keeping the ball going as far as finishing the implementation and whatnot. I was there 2 years, 10 months, and 19 days, not that anyone was counting. But after I left there to be an MIC in Houston, it dawned on me how important having gone there and learned why things are the way they are in the world of Washington made that job so much easier. There was a lot of windmills that my friends and colleagues at other offices tilted at that I knew was the windmill's going to win, fella, quit it. I just had seen that happen. I knew what they expected and left it alone. So that was actually my dream job. I told a boss of mine in San Antonio when he asked me what my career ambition was, I want your job. Which shocked him a little bit because I was 30 years old at the time. You know, most people don't say that at 30 years old, but I really did. I wanted to be an MIC. I like mingling with the people part of the problem, and being in charge of a weather office sounded like the real deal, and it was. I moved to Houston intending to stay there that 5 years, and as you notice, I stayed there like 15. I never even worked on my resume again until the Hurricane Center job came up. We implemented the modernization. I would call that my best accomplishment there, the one that I'll always remember, but the most unique one was that building. That building is a co-location of the Galveston County Emergency Management Office and the National Weather Service Forecast Office. And things started working so much better and coordinating between us and them because we saw each other every day. We talked about these things, and our language started mingling with theirs, so we were communicating to them in the language they understand, and they were beginning to get better at communicating to us in a language that we understand. Every organization has their acronym soup that's unintelligible to anyone else in the outer world, and that's one of the problems you see from time to time in the communication and the emergency management world. I have no doubt that that's part of what happened in Georgia with the debacle on their snowstorm last month, or in January there, because something wasn't communicating. A lot of interesting storms. I just have the highlights on some of them. That picture on the upper right is the botched evacuation during Hurricane Rita. There are 14 lanes of pavement there in the woodlands heading north. There are 16 lanes of cars heading north. North of Conroe, there are 4 lanes of pavement heading north. Any question as to why it took 27 hours for these folks to get to Big D? Yeah, it's a big problem. I'm going to get into that later on the problem. The other big thing that happened there was the urban flood caused by Tropical Storm Allison. It's like the 25th costliest tropical disaster in this country. It's the only tropical storm. We always wondered, Bob Maddox and Gary and I would talk about what's going to happen when one of these unloads itself over a large urban center. Well, now we had the experiment. It's not pretty. 100,000 cars were flooded, destroyed, basically. 50,000 homes were flooded. 65% of the flooded homes were not in the 100-year floodplain. And therefore, they probably didn't have flood insurance. Big problem. Well, my surprise dream job was at the National Hurricane Center. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Max Mayfield and I got to knowing each other through the hurricane preparedness effort. We had about the same philosophy on that, so we talk a lot about it, and he'd be picking my brain for, well, how do you deal with this at the local level? What's different than what you do in Florida and all that sort of stuff. So he retired, and there for a short period of time, my former boss was put in that job. It didn't work. And I was detailed over there to help out, and I decided I could help out, so I put in for the job, and lo and behold, I got it. So it was my surprise dream job. Running the Hurricane Center was an absolute hoot. I'll have to tell you that. It was about a 60 to 70 hour a week job for me. There's just a whole lot of stuff I don't really know about the inner workings of the whole business that I had to fast forward on to learn it, plus fix a lot of crisis stuff. But I had most of the fun doing it. I could have probably done it forever, but my wife would have probably said, fine, send the paycheck back here. She didn't like Miami. It's funny, a lot of people didn't. I actually found it an interesting place. Well, you get to meet a lot of important people. One of the ways we communicate from the Hurricane Center is we actually have a FEMA meteorologist assigned to the National Hurricane Center. And we actually have a secure briefing room that links through FEMA. And when there's a landfall, every day we're giving a briefing, but it's usually one of the specialists that's doing it. When there's a landfall threat, the FEMA administrator, all three of the ones that I associated with, wanted the main briefing, which was done at right after noon, to be done by the director. So one of my, and I thought that's great, fine by me. It gives me something besides bureaucracy to do. I enjoy doing that. This is an example of how it works. I would be briefing off a flat screen on the meteorology. It only took about 10 minutes. I kept it short, I kept it simple, and let their questions dictate what else I talked about. And this particular picture on the upper left there, it's my storm surge guy that can feed me answers to dicey questions real quick if they come up on the storm surge, because that's a real challenge technically to get right. And he says, actually, though, that's a picture of him praying for forgiveness if we've done something wrong with the storm. The other picture where it was another unforgettable moment. Remember the big oil well blow up out in the Gulf off Mississippi? Well, this was the Monday or so before the start of hurricane season, in probably end of May back in 2010. And I was actually called in to do the briefing on what the risk of a hurricane. This was an overall briefing on what we're going to do about the spill during the summer. But it's in the White House Situation Room. You talk about, whoa, man, I'm in the deep end now. That feeling. You're sitting there by rank. And of course, the president, vice president, John Brennan, the security advisor, and a bunch of secretaries. Then you get to the administrators at FEMA, Administrator NOAA. Guess who's in the last seat? I'm the lowest ranked person in that room, and I'm out of 12,000 NOAA employees, I was the 70th highest paid. So there's some heavyweights in that room all the time, and it's very intimidating to be in that. But on the other hand, it's just like any other talk. You know more about what you're telling them than they do. So just be professional and tell them. So we basically went over how we're going to handle a hurricane in the event of a threat to the BP area. And believe it or not, nothing happened. We had hurricanes all over the place, but none came up into the Northeast Gulf or Central Gulf during the 2010 season. Talk about lucky. This is what it looks like on the lower right from the FEMA briefing room in there. And all those, they can look at all the people that are on the video teleconference, all the different EOCs and department heads and stuff, mostly in Washington, but there's also the Northcom and Southcom of the military. There's also state governor, most of the governor's offices and the governors themselves will be on for a landfall threat in the area. The other big thing I did during storms was the director and the deputy alternated on-off for 12 hours doing the media briefings, TV stuff. So we did a lot of that while you were there. And then you got to meet a lot of really important people. And the cool part of the job is you go around the world and the country preaching hurricane safety. And the upper left picture is it's a meteorology directors of all the Caribbean basin countries. We meet once a year. The director of the Hurricane Center is the chair of that committee, and that's where the names are changed. And it's really fun to watch. They get all mad about it. There's not enough French names. The Spanish don't like the way you spell that name. Way it went. We lived through it all. The lower part here, this picture here, those four ladies Three ladies there, well-armed ladies, I might add, El Salvador Secret Service. Crime was so bad, the gang wars were so bad when we visited there. We had an armed escort to our hotel, and they all hang around outside the hotel. I don't care if they're only, they refer to me as El Gigante Importante. That was a little unnerving. I mean, you're at a Hilton hotel right down the street from the capital of the country, and it's armed to the hilt to keep the drug wars away from you. And I like to do the Where's Waldo thing. I get out in the crowds there and have them take a picture of the thing. Where's Bill? Well, he's the only guy with blue eyes and white. You can find him. By the numbers, the hurricane seasons were 3 active and 1 not active. Everyone forgot about 2008. We talk about it's been so long since we had any landfalls. Well, if you get hung up on the Saffir-Simpson scale, yay, we didn't have a whole lot, but there was almost $50 billion in losses in the U.S. in 2008. Pretty amazing year. And the Gulf Coast got whacked almost everywhere with a hurricane. A whole bunch of them that were 5 or 10 knots below Category 3. Doesn't make that much difference if your building code's weak and you're going to get damage. And you get to work a lot of storms. A bunch that you never hear about are in the Eastern Pacific. They go shipping lanes and then out in the middle of nowhere. But that is our responsibility. So we forecast those with the same products and services that come out with the Atlantic. The billion-dollar events were Dolly, Gustav, Ike, and then Irene in 2012. There's what really counts on this, though. This is what you're there for. This is what we're trying to get rid of, is the 2,000 lives lost. Now, almost all of those during my tenure there occurred in the Caribbean Basin or Central America, mostly due to rainwater flooding. Gustav killed quite a few people coming across some of the islands in Cuba, but the Cubans usually take one of the zeros off their losses. So you always hear they don't have any losses from hurricanes, and insider info was telling us, no, it's not true. But they had a huge storm surge from Gustav, so it's understandable. The picture on the right is on the Galveston seawall, the waves from Ike slamming into the seawall. The seawall is 17 feet above mean sea level. The waves were breaking just barely below that at the peak of the storm. And that monument is actually a monument to the 8,000 people that lost their life in the 1900 storm. In the time-honored tradition of former Hurricane Center directors, I'm now the 4th one that does some TV. Other than doing things like this and a little bit of stuff on mitigation that I'm interested in, I've got a really great part-time gig that I only go to work if there's an interesting hurricane story to do, June through October. The rest of the time I'm left alone to play golf, and they pay me to do that. Not bad. But I'm getting an education from the inside now of how the broadcast media works as a business, and it doesn't change my opinion on the fact that there's not enough science and too much entertainment involved in it, but I now understand the drivers on it. It's the admin and the bottom line people that look at it as this is what people want to watch. I don't want to watch car wrecks. Car wreck in Houston, give me a break. Breaking news would be, folks, it's 6:30 in the evening at rush hour, and I have no accidents to report in Houston. That would be breaking news. Okay, I'm going to shift gears. That's for now, that's the end of my career talk, but let's go into forecasting a little bit. I always like Yogi Berra's quote. Would you agree with me with Yogi that it's kind of difficult? It's easy to do a hindcast. You see it all the time after an event. You should have been able to forecast that. Got all the data and the end result, why not? If you don't have the end result, then you forecast. And I'm just going to focus on the hurricane part. One of the big success story in the hurricane business is the track forecast. If we still had the error rates when I started my career, we'd be doomed because we need to evacuate now in most locations at about 48 hours, in some locations beyond 72. The track forecast skill at 72 hours back then was somewhere around 450 miles. So a storm like Hurricane Allen coming out of the Caribbean was at the 3-day point. The error cone, if we were drawing them back there, would run from east of New Orleans to near Tampico. Now, how can you make an effective decision if you're an evacuation decision maker at any coastal community with that much uncertainty? So it's really good that that several big things have happened. The satellite data into models, better reconnaissance, better models, and the computing power to run those models as what has allowed us to reach this skill. And you notice how in the last decade or so, how smooth the 24 and 48 hour lines, the year-to-year downward trend. The other thing that's starting to show in the 48 and 72 hours is that it's a repetitive skill. We don't have an off year. Some of these off years will be when there's a real low number of storms and you have one storm that you botch big time. It'll skew the date off. But when you look at it over the long haul, we actually use a 5-year running mean to develop our risk numbers to create things like the cone. Hurricane Irene in 2011, we got all kinds of accolades for what a great track forecast it was. And you can't find the actual line because it's buried by the forecast lines. But I want to show you, I was under a lot of pressure my last 2 years from the Department of Homeland Security to increase the forecast to 7 days and to give them specific storm surge forecasts out at least 5 days, and that they needed it to make the proper actions. Okay, here is what the cone represents, roughly where 70% of the storms should go. Take 70% of our error function, and you simply use the average error at each time step, do the 70%, draw the circles, and it creates the cone. This is the 5-day forecast for 2 a.m. on Sunday is in North Carolina, and yay, verily, it got pretty close to there. However, it got there on Saturday. So if you needed a 5-day forecast and you bid off on that, you lost a day. I am of the opinion, I think Craig Fugate still is 72 hours and give you a pretty good forecast. You make sure you can do what you have to do in 72 hours. You can control that. I can't control the skill of the forecast of the storm scientifically. You force me to give you a distinct forecast. It will be here at X time and your storm surge will be there. I will be wrong most of the time, and you will come back and say it was my fault that I didn't act on it. And we deal with that in all kinds of the forecast world, the deterministic between probabilistic. And the longer people want a lead time for whatever it is we're trying to forecast, the more probability becomes the more important part of the forecast. And if we cave into this stuff, we're not going to change it. You can easily add new stuff. Try getting rid of it. At the end of every month, the Hurricane Center has to type up a nice little summary of what happened in the month before and send it out. We're trying to reduce some of the services that were no longer needed. Somebody decided they needed that, and we were forbidden to turn it off. You cannot turn stuff off very easily. So you've got to be very careful when you add something that it really is what people need. Finish this one. There we go. Okay, our biggest forecast challenge. I don't think that improving the track forecast, especially inside of 72 hours, much from where it is now, will effectively change the outcome on decision making on evacuations. But our biggest challenge is rapid and change of intensity. This chart is how we plot for verification of the history of the storm's intensity and the forecast guidance at a specific time. And this is a real storm, but for the sake of discussion, let's assume that we have a developing tropical storm in the southern Gulf of Mexico, and it's forecast to come north and be on the Louisiana coast in 48 hours. They have a 48-hour decision point, which means right now, if you have a Category 3 or higher storm, your emergency management decision would be evacuate, start the evacuation. Well, the colored lines are all our model forecast of intensity, and the highest one is 65 knots, and the lowest one weakens into a depression. This is not atypical. It's very difficult to forecast, especially at the starting point of a storm intensity. Say we took the high road and we said 65 knots at landfall, 48 hours. Nobody is going to pull an evacuation at 48 hours. The people who would have to evacuate for a 65 knot storm, you can move at 24. Not a problem. 24 hours later, yay, verily, the storm's intensified. It's gone from 35 knots to 65 knots, but the last 6 hours it's leveled off and it's not increased anymore. It's right on the cusp of being called a rapid intensifier. We're now going to forecast, the guidance for this actually came out for the next 24 hours to increase 15 more knots to 80 knots. But now you only have 24 hours to landfall. Okay, who are you going to evacuate? Well, they'll evacuate the folks right on the beaches, the Category 1 folks and the vacationers and things like that. It's too late to evacuate the whole place. You'll get them stuck on the road. That night, the storm went ballistic. It intensified right up to landfall from 65 knots to 145 knots. That was my biggest nightmare, was having a rapid intensifier occur overnight in the Gulf of Mexico. And it'd be too late, heading right towards one of the big evacuation problems, it'd be too late to execute an evacuation. So I thought it'd be a pretty rare event, and one this strong would be. But I was thinking maybe we'd have 10 events that met my criteria, so I had the specialists who worked the database come up with a graph for me, a plot of them. And this is what they found for the Gulf of Mexico. Only 3 of these would have given you more than 48 hours lead time. There's 30-odd storms in that track, and a list of some of the more noteworthy ones are over there. Now, Katrina was one of the ones that lasted almost 66 hours from coming out as a Category 1 off Florida to where it made landfall. And that was as close as you can come to blowing an evacuation. I mean, it was really a panic rush at the last minute because they waited too long to make the decision. And it's pretty natural. A lot of blame went in that, but the uncertainty alone and the fact that everyone hates to evacuate, it's a difficult call. Some of the other scientific challenges, for those that might be interested in actually researching this, we don't have good verification numbers, but we don't have good tools yet in the models with a lot of success to do structure and size. On structure, whether we're maintaining an eye wall, whether we're building more rain bands, the timing of and the type of transition into extratropical or whatever it would be. There's a lot of hang-ups within the Hurricane Center about what you call these things. Kind of like what we used to have with, is it a supercell or not? And as if it was a step function. And there's still some of that kind of mindset in the tropical. It's either is or it isn't. Actually, I'm more in the hybrid, that it's a spectrum of types of storms in there, and Sandy sure points that out. It's neither one of those if you wanted to have to actually pin it down. And then the detailed impacts. We're just now working hard on the storm surge and finding out just how difficult and how little we actually had. We thought we had more than we had. It's taken longer to come up with good knowledge of the risk. Outside of the U.S., there is none. When people think there was a good idea what the storm surge would be in Tacloban in the Philippines, it's not true. They don't even know the bathymetry accurately in those little gulfs and bays in most countries, or they don't have detailed, they may have one elevation point on that whole area of land there to base the whole thing off of. It costs money. We don't even do it very well here, we're finding out from the flood program. So a lot of work needs to be done on that. I think that'll help in many mitigation things. A better understanding how this works gives you better ammunition to decide what to build, how strong it has to be, and where. And then the excessive rainfall and resultant flooding. The flooding bayous in the city of Houston are 2 kilometers wide on average and 5 kilometers long. And people tell me they can model that out more than a few hours. I say, sure, show me one. And I haven't seen one yet. Not one, much less a whole study that shows through verification this is something we can do with skill. And that beyond it, we can do as good as we're doing now without adding that skill factor to it, which is basically you say, big rain's coming, some of you are going to flood. A little bit about Sandy. Such a fascinating storm, and no, I was not lamenting that I retired. I was glad as hell I didn't have to work at all the political crap that went on surrounding it. I would not have done well with that, to tell you the truth. It was a huge storm. That's the overwater part. That was the extent of 25 knot or higher winds. It's huge, just huge. Now, how uncommon is it? Now, that red chart there is all the tropical cyclones we've analyzed since 1851. I dare you to find one that takes the track Sandy did. There's nothing coming inland over New Jersey at a right angle. It didn't happen. Go back and look at your big extratropical lows up there and find one that did there. No. Guy from Rutgers presented a study at the AMS, and in his study, he came up with it probably was around a 700-year event, plus or minus a couple hundred years, because we don't really have the data to support the study. And a lot of that had to do, and his point was the latitude and proximity to land in the first place that made it so rare. Are these really rare storms? Well, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, pay attention to the storms that go on throughout the dead of winter in the North Atlantic and North Pacific. And if you look at that storm on the top and then the storm on the bottom, which is Sandy, you'll see a lot of similarities. The cold air is blasted out way out to the east of the center of the low. In Sandy, the cold air is blasted way out east of the center of the low. The warm conveyor coming into the low is being pulled out and basically cut off with maybe a new wave trying to form out to the east. And there's a warm seclusion of convection around the center of the extratropical low. And it had a huge wind area. There are a lot of very similar aspects of this storm to what you saw in Sandy. No two storms are alike, I know, but I kind of found it fascinating. I found two more in the last two winters over the North Atlantic. Now, I wish I'd known this crap when I was in Iceland. I bet I had one while I was there, just didn't know what they were. How many of you think it's cool to do seasonal hurricane forecasts? Give yourself a hand. It's a total waste of time. Maybe not in a research mode, but as a usable product for the public, it's snake oil. It's been sold. I won't go into that part, but I will talk about what happened last year. Here were some of the key forecasts. I don't know anyone that forecast a low-end season last year. All the stuff that we thought was important for a big hurricane season looked like it was coming into play. And we were ready for the tropical season from hell. And everybody's ready, and that's what the forecasts were all saying, but here's what actually happened. El Busto Grande, it was the weakest season we've had in decades, mostly weak tropical storms. The ACE forecast, the ACE was way down on the 20% low side, and the forecast was in the 30% high side. A complete bust. Usually when we miss on the seasonal forecast, it's by degree, not kind. If it's forecast high, real high, and we miss, it might be closer to average or a little above, something like that. So I'm sure they're doing a lot of research on it, and they'll come up with things. But I want you to consider just one set of observations and one thought that I have. The observations are during the peak of the season, those yellows and oranges off of Africa over to South America and covering the western Atlantic. That's the main development region during the peak of the season. And drier, the normal air is the death knell of any attempt to develop a tropical cyclone. The strong Saharan dust episodes. How many of you think this dust is one of the factors that causes storms to not form? Okay, there's a lot of people that do. There's a lot of debate on that. I don't think that the jury's totally out on that. And then there's upwelling cooler water in the eastern Atlantic. And so we were observing and forecasting above normal sea temperatures right off of Africa, which had been occurring for several years now, and allowing for really far eastern, the waves would come off of Africa and immediately develop a tropical cyclone out of it. In the normal mode, they come off Africa, weaken a little bit, and then strengthen as they get into the main development region. But for most of the last several years that I had worked with, they were showing their head real fast and growing. This year it was killing them. They come off Africa, the water's cold, the dust is out there, and bam, they're gone. Beautiful waves are coming off Africa, and nothing happened with them. So those are the observations of what went wrong. And here's my thought. I think they're all related to a stronger than normal Azores Bermuda subtropical high. Think about it. You have the tropical monsoon trough over Africa and the heat low developing in the Sahara. You have a stronger than normal high. What's happening to get a stronger than normal high? Something is forcing mass into the high, and you have sinking air. Sinking air is what? Warm and dry, right? Warm and dry air was observed over the tropical development region. The winds were blowing harder over the Sahara. That's what got the big plumes of dust over there. What happens when your pressure gradient gets higher between the high and the low? Winds increase. So I think that And if the winds increase, the trade winds increase, what happens to the ocean water on the coast it's blowing away from? It upwells. You get cooler water. How many people here are doing how many people in here know of anyone doing research on subtropical highs? It's not sexy, right? I mean, if you're studying severe weather, do you study the high that builds in behind it? I actually think you should. No one studies this stuff. We really don't know what kind of error. The errors in Ike's forecast were not caught. We did data denial studies on the systems that were affecting the forecast for Hurricane Ike, and everyone thought the thesis was that the models didn't handle a shortwave coming out of the Pacific Northwest, weakening the high more than they thought, and that's why the storm moved out. The only thing they could modulate that would get the track that was that Ike actually occurred was modulating the high, not the troughs. And they only did that because they kept whining to do it. So there you go. Someone wants a study on improving tropical forecasting. Subtropical highs are cool. This year, how many of you know we've got a big El Nino coming? How many are sure we have a big El Nino coming? Thank you. Hey, I saw what was supposedly an expert saying this is going to be a big El Nino. There's no one I know of that would commit to the strength of an El Nino in the spring, early spring, because this is when the signal's the weakest and the most forecast error in the eastern, the tropical Pacific Ocean temperatures occur. So you don't want to hang your hat totally on what's forecast, but hey, we're overdue an El Nino. We've been in 2 years of neutral to La Nina state already. So it seems like a pretty good forecast for an El Nino. We just don't know how strong it'll be. And it looks like it's ready to kick in, so for the peak of the hurricane season, it should be in place. My opinion, the biggest modulator of the number of storms that has any correlation mathematically is the occurrence or non-occurrence of an El Nino. Neutral and La Nina years are almost equal in big seasons, so it's not a good discriminator to say La Nina big season. But most El Nino years of moderate or higher level are reduced seasons. And the reason being is that the flow it sets up and the subsidence over the Caribbean and the shear over the Western Atlantic almost shuts down everything below 20 degrees north. And that takes out most of your storms. The ones that do form are in the edge of the subtropics outside of that sheer and dry air. And factor two is the ocean heat content. The relative anomaly, if it's warm, more of the ocean is warmer than normal, and it can only be like a half a degree, but it's a huge amount of heat, modulates how active a season is. And we're in these periodic paths of getting a lot of storms every year. The high activity part is mainly because the tropical ocean and the Atlantic stays somewhat warmer than normal year to year. Then number three, we don't know everything. Sometimes I don't think we know anything on this stuff, especially last year. Though I wouldn't want to write these El Nino years off. Two of my favorites, 1983, purple circles the Caribbean and Main Development Region, zip, nada, zilch. East Coast, zip, nada, zilch. Houston, Category 3, Hurricane Alicia. Until Lake, that was the big one that everyone that was alive around that time was referring to. It was Alicia, and it occurred in a 4-storm season. Now, if people are believing that there's something they can actually use the seasonal forecast for, that means that if I forecast 15 storms, you might take more action. If I forecast 4, maybe you'll take less. And that's the wrong answer. Until we can actually forecast with at least something better than a coin toss what the chance of landfall at your location is in advance, doesn't tell me crap. And then there's 1992. We had 7 storms that year, only one that made landfall in the U.S. It was Andrew. Tell those folks that it was a dull season and nothing really happened. So that's my sermon for the day. On the technology side, this is my forecast. Your computing capabilities, I think, are going to get you a 10-day skillful track forecast on hurricanes. We improved from 3 to 5 in about 15 years of work, and we're ready to go we're almost there on 5 to 7, where it meets a linear growth rate of the error curve, and it's taken about 10 years. And each one of the improvements has been with almost a one of the more major improvements in the big supercomputing models being used. So, and they keep building better ones and new ones come out there. So I'm fairly confident in that one. Some of the research that's being done with radar and stuff flying into the hurricanes on the research rapid intensification is showing some promise on cracking the code of what actually causes rapid intensification. Because until we actually can define that mathematically, we can't model it. And if we can't model it, all we can do is observe trends and do short-term forecasts on it. And I actually think during your career, we're going to crack the nut on that. The problem is if the most popular theory, which is that the convective interactions, convective scale interactions within the eye wall are the key predictor of rapid intensification, you're going to run into chaos theory. You've got to crack that code if you're going to forecast under the statistical type forecast of intensity beyond probably 24 hours, but certainly beyond 48. It's still better than that. We show no skill. We show about an amount of skill at 24 hours and at 48 on rapid intensification. Either way, going up or going down. The only rapid weakening we forecast correctly is landfall. Pretty easy there. And I have no idea where this stuff's going to go. How many? Well, you guys are all young, but some of you old guys that sit in the back so you can't hear me. How many of you thought that you'd have one of these 10 years ago? No idea. We had at my Houston office, we had an internet website for 2 weeks before I even knew we had it. We had some enterprising young forecaster that took a spine on it and said, let's just do this. What's this? You know, oh, okay. So can you even imagine what 40 years from now you guys will have at your hands for communicating both to you and the data and outward to the users? It should be fun. However, there's a societal problem with tropical cyclones. I contend that most of the improvements we can make technologically will do absolutely nothing to improve the outcome of these storms. We may save a few more lives, but a lot of the people that die now know that they were warned, know that they were told to left because they were stubborn jackasses they chose not to leave. And trust me, you guys aren't the jackass whisperers. If someone says they're going to stay, they're going to stay, and then some of them are going to die. The Bolivar Peninsula was full of that didn't want to leave. And most of them begged at the last minute. There were 780 people rescued by helicopter in 45-knot winds from the Bolivar by Coast Guard. So young people are risking their lives to save some stupid guy that decided to stay there. Most of those guys had interesting backgrounds. There's 100 people still not accounted for. Most of them have criminal records, and I think they're alive and chose that moment to go somewhere else. But here's the problem. There's the beach. There's a beach town in Sandy. There's the water everywhere. How can these people not know they're at risk from water? They don't. A lot of them have no idea. And then there's the big one come into a place like Tacloban where you have that's the worst possible, everything about that is worst possible for those people. They don't live in houses that can stand the wind. Nobody can stand the force of the water that's driving up there. And they probably they don't have good land measurements, but they had somewhere between 20 and 35 feet of storm surge come into their town at that. And everybody's talking about why didn't they evacuate, where were the shelters? This is a poor place in the Philippines, folks, that normally doesn't get big typhoons. It's south of the path where most of the big typhoons have hit. It's a different culture. Can't compare it to what we do. The real issue is these storms are going to keep on coming in. You're going to keep doing better forecasts. Do you think it'll change the damage at all? At the same time, our forecast has been improving almost linearly. Our losses have been increasing exponentially. Because of good communication and a warning system, we can get people out, and true evacuation planning, we get people out of the way, therefore we have the loss of life dropping on the storm. I thought it was mainly a U.S. thing, and then I found this on the World Meteorological Organization's website. Now, it's hydrometeorological, so it's both floods and it's mostly floods and tropical cyclones, but it's the same graph. The loss of life has dropped from 3 million or so a decade worldwide to our weather events to down to less than 250,000 in a decade, while the cost has gone up from near nothing, it wasn't worth much where it was hitting back then anyway, to $500 billion. in a decade due to these losses. So it's a worldwide problem, and it's, I think, mostly due to growth. This is growth in the U.S. My town has gone from 1960 from a million and change to almost 5 million. Miami's gone from less than a million to 5.5. I think they got a hurricane problem, that there's lots of people that have never experienced one. Jacksonville, Florida, and then Boston even has grown, which surprised me. I would have thought that a lot of that growth had already occurred. So why is it costing so much? See that figure there? In 1960, the average house was 1,200 square feet. My house that I grew up in was built in '53. It was 1,300 square feet. That meant we lived in a mansion. By comparison, I don't think they build a 1,200 square foot single family house in the Houston area. The average house is 2,400 square feet. In most of our neighborhoods in our city, the average is more like 2,700 square feet. And what happens if you have 27 square foot a house? You fill it full of crap. We have less people per house now than we had in 1960, so something's got to go in there. My wife won't let me put a picture of our house in there to prove it. My house is 2,000 square feet, so, but it is full. A hurricane hits, it wipes out a bunch of these houses with wind and storm surge. The guys that do damage assessment, if the fascia boards and a roof peel has occurred and water's got in, the roof damage averages around 15,000. An average loss of the interior contents is closer to 50. So that's why you have a storm like Ike hit a highly populated place like Houston and do $30 billion worth of damage, yet relatively few houses were totaled out. Every one of these houses that had roof damage and a pounding rain had all this water come in and do damage to the property that was inside. A few of the places at risk for the big one. Katrina, Sandy, 1938. No question those are big ones. Andrew. So a lot of talks I'm asked to give are more on what's the likelihood of a big one occurring in our community. So I have all this list of these. And those are the ones with a high population. You take anywhere along the coast, even if you live in a small town and the big one comes in there for you, that was the big one. Let's look at a couple of these. This is my worst case, mainly because my concern as Hurricane Center Director was loss of life. I can't do anything to save your property. From Sarasota southward, most of these are outside of, if you take Tampa out, it'd be more like 3 million people south of Sarasota, growing to about 5 in the next several decades. The highest percentage of retirees of any coastal region is on that coastline. Why would I bring that up? It's late, the pizza's kicked in. It's amazing. You guys aren't hurricane people, I know that. This is usually, now the audience sparks something up.
Well, retirees normally are harder to get to move out because of some.
Yes, we're jackasses. I am now one of that demographic. In Iowa State, my house is wind engineered to 120 and it's out of the surge zone and I'm crazy. Plus we got 3 dogs. I don't want to ride anywhere in a car with 3 dogs. Yes, the only demographic that matches failure to evacuate is age. And even in New Orleans, where we thought it might be ethnic or poverty, age. Highest statistic. You want to ever read about this? Shit, I forgot the book. I'll come up with that later. It's an important book you want to read if you're into risk. But anyway, really important on here is those shaded areas represent all of the inhabitants south of Sarasota. All are subject to storm surge. Nobody will open a shelter in a place subject to storm surge. They have to evacuate. Emergency management last year, after doing a recap of the study on that, raised their clearance time to evacuate everyone from 72 hours to 90 hours. The last big storms that hit down there were in the 1890s. One was a Category 4, and it lasted 72 hours from birth to death. Besides, who's going to leave at 90 hours? Certainly not us stubborn old guys. I don't think anyone will. It'll be clear blue skies. There probably won't be much of a storm because the ones that are going to do that are coming out of the Western Caribbean and recurving northeast, or late in the season coming straight northeast out of the Gulf of Mexico. Hasn't happened in a while. I don't know why. No one knows why we have these little trends there. Yes, sir?
Do you have stats to compare this worst case scenario to what happened with Charlie in 2004?
Yeah, the big difference in Charlie, it was one of those rapid intensifiers, is that it went from an average size Category 1 hurricane to a tiny near Category 4 hurricane 15 miles across. The size of the hurricane is hugely important to the amount of storm surge you get. So you actually got storm surge more like a high-end Category 1 hurricane, or you would have had an unbelievable catastrophe where it occurred. There was no way you were going to pull off the evacuation. And the ironic thing is the only county that didn't evacuate for Category 2 on the west coast south of Tampa was the county where Charlie made landfall. The emergency manager there got fixated on the point showing the track line going to Tampa. It didn't account for the possibility of an eastward drift of the track. Another place, South Carolina to Georgia, they don't call this the low country just because they like to. It's low. Almost all of Charleston is at risk of flooding. And I'll show you some of the problems with that. And its fastest demographic in their growth is retirees. A lovely place. For those who never visited there, I highly suggest it. Going to move there, try to go a little farther inland. Because they get big ones. I was sent over there to be the bad guy to a public meeting with the insurance commissioner and citizens about the rise in their insurance rates. They had a citizen there that claimed that Chris Landsey from the Hurricane Center said they weren't at risk of big hurricanes. So I got Chris Landsey's side, and they paid me to come over there and give a talk with Chris Landsey's slides that showed how many big hurricanes. They had almost the same risk as Houston of a big hurricane. Angry citizens. You ever heard the term caves at a public meeting? Citizens against virtually everything. These were the ones. But I mean, I had Chris's slides. What were they going to say? And these are two of the big ones. The Sea Islands Hurricane 1893 killed over 2,000 people. And not a whole lot of people lived there back then. Still kind of recovering from the Civil War era. And then Hugo in 89, if you'll notice, it just grazed that circle I drew where the biggest threat is. It went just to the right of the big population center. Hugo was huge. That's the eye wall several hours after landfall. That big concentric eye wall looks like a big fat tire like that. It's not ingesting any dry air. It takes longer for that to dissipate than one that's not so well structured or is ingesting any dry air. And this thing was moving 20 miles an hour. The decay of a hurricane is mainly a function of how long it's been over land, not the speed it's moving. So it's about 12 hours to go down from a Cat 4 to just below a hurricane. Well, in those 12 hours, it made it to the Piedmont and to the Appalachians as a hurricane. So Charlotte, North Carolina, trees were being blown down everywhere, and people had no idea what was happening to them. And the winds were strong. It intensified right up to landfall, and it was big, so it created a huge storm surge. You see the little line going through there? It's easier just to talk about it. You see the line going up through there past the gray area. The gray area is metropolitan Charleston. All the big storm surge comes in the right front quadrant of a hurricane. Charleston was basically spared. They had some wind damage, but the surge never got into most of the buildings. The big surge went over all the barrier islands where all the rich people lived, and they swore they'd never build there again. I forgot, I should have included pictures. Oh, did they build back? Now they're $1 million houses instead of $4 million houses. The bulk of the storm surge went up into this area called Bulls Bay and made landfall on the mainland in a place called Francis Marion National Forest. Guess what they don't put in national forests? Cities. So a 20-foot storm surge went where less than 1,000 people lived. And so the loss of life was fairly low. They actually did a good evacuation ahead of Hugo. But what if Hugo? One of the things I really liked to do was to take a storm that was recent and then move it to different places, keeping the storm itself like it was to show people how sensitive the forecast is to slight deviations in the track. Now, I didn't have to do this one because East Carolina did the study for me. And the main peninsula of Charleston is the middle upper picture there. That blue represents anywhere from 1 meter to 4 meters above land. If Hugo had gone in on Keel Island instead of Sullivan's Island, it's 25 miles difference. Now, I have people telling me they want a deterministic forecast of storm surge 5 days out. I can barely give you that with a 50% type error score at 24 hours. Scientifically. Anyone can give you a forecast, but it's crap if you try to give it in 5 days, and you don't want to do that. And we use this to show people just how vulnerable they are over there. Yea, verily, less than half of them have flood insurance. Even when you show them this, they're not convinced they need it. Because we use 100-year events for flood insurance. That's a subject of a lot longer talk, and it's painful. Okay, my hometown. That picture of the Houston Ship Channel is where the San Jacinto River and Buffalo Bayou come out into Galveston Bay. And as far as you can see, underneath the haze in there are these white structures looking in there. Right on that horizon, I bet you can see downtown Houston. The high rises, I think, maybe. There are 250 refineries and petrochem plants on that channel, plus the port that dumps stuff off. Most are vulnerable to 15-foot storm surge. The storm surge picture on there was taken by the folks at Rice, moving it down the coast, and it's actually our 48-hour forecast from the Hurricane Center. Jacked it up 15 knots, 20 knots, to 115-knot storm, making landfall on the west end of Galveston Island. The storm surge on the Houston Ship Channel in that graphic ranges from 24 to 28 feet. And all those plants are vulnerable at 15. If all of them went under, it could be about $180 billion. And there's 175 employees there. A lot of them would never be rebuilt. They're grandfathered on the safety and air quality laws that were in place at the time they were built. So lake hits, and the picture there of the last house standing. By the way, he had to replace everything on the interior, all the sheetrock, all the flooring, because water came in all over the place from the waves. But what he did is he built his grade up 4 feet higher than his neighbors. All the neighbors are gone. They were deposited 10 miles inland over Chambers County when the storm surge finished with them. And eerily, I was just amazed at this, the storm track of it and the storm track of the 1900 storm are very, very similar. The difference maybe being the Galveston storm in 1900 didn't become a hurricane until it got to the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, if any of you read the book Isaac's Storm, you know it's passed off as nonfiction. There's a lot of misstatements in there. The assumption of the author is that the thing could be forecasted. We didn't have any ship-to-shore radio in that era. The only way you found out if a ship was hit with a hurricane is if it survived it and made it to port. Not very useful for a warning. And yes, the Cubans said it was heading towards Texas, but really what they said was it's left Cuba moving northwest as a 50-knot tropical storm. They didn't forecast specific forecast back then. It was the direction it was going, and you just translated it. So there was no evacuations back then. There was no plan to evacuate. That's why we had many multi-hundreds to thousands of people dying in landfalling hurricanes throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. Once we had abilities to communicate to people, it got a little better on that. And the ship-to-shore radio was a huge breakthrough in remote sensing. Then the ship starts getting hit, telegraphs in the report, and you know you've got something out there. It's not really talked about much outside of the Houston area, even though it's the third costliest on the list. You know why? Other than everybody hates Texas these days. Sorry about that.
Why was it not talked about?
Yeah.
It's only category 2. People say only.
That's one of my pet peeves, but that's not the ultimate reason. I mean, Irene was the same way, but it's still talked about a lot. What happened? This happened on the 13th of September, 2008. What happened on the 15th of September? The financial crash. Bigger disaster. Affected everybody. Other than the Galveston paper, no one talked about it. Well, in Houston, no one was talking about it after the crash that Monday. It's sort of continued that way. Other things have superseded it. So A lot of things that could have been learned and done after Hurricane Ike has just never happened. Just shake it, is that the drill? First have it work, damn it! You know how you make the computers work? Well, I mean, this happens to me at home all the time. I'm glad to see it happen in a place where people know what they're doing with these machines. There it is. Just another picture with a couple more facts about if Ike was 20 more, I do the 20 south and no change in intensity. Another 170,000 homes would flood just 20 miles further away. In those houses, who, by the way, were all ordered to evacuate, there was an estimated 200,000 people who did not evacuate. They would have to be rescued or they would die in that flood, especially the ones down low to water. The Johnson Space Center would be about 4 to 6 feet across the land of the Johnson Space Center in water. And the losses, according to Rice, would be $80 billion. It was 30 on the actual track. And that doesn't account for economic loss. They really don't have a way to do that. I'm going to move quick here, folks. I'm not going to talk about that one. Mitigation. You guys deal with mitigation at all in any of your classes, or is that an engineering outside interest? I kind of wish we did. The term resiliency is getting intertangled with that, and we're getting pulled in the profession to help design resilient communities. But mitigation is better land use, in a hurricane business, better land use and better building codes. And I contend there's almost nowhere in this country out of extreme South Florida that has a realistic building code for the risks that are heading at them, or enforces them. They don't even enforce them very well in Miami. There's not enough trained people building fast. There are only a few people that are good at giving I had my own private engineer do my house, so probably the best house built in the neighborhood. But we're not enforcing the codes that already exist, and most of the codes aren't strong enough. Certainly not in Texas. I really don't know what you're like in Oklahoma. That's a very uncomforting note. Building in surge impact areas is just insane. Right after all the people died in the evacuation of Rita, the land across from the National Weather Service office was sold and a nursing home was built in it. The office is in a Category 3 evacuation zone. Does that make any sense to anybody? I was told to mind my own business. And there's no adequate shelter, and the evacuation times keep getting longer and longer. Well, the thing that's been proposed by the big engineering interests in Houston is build a dike, called the Ike Dike, all the way from High Island down to San Luis Pass with floodgates on either side. Now, they estimate $10 billion to build it. I worked for the government long enough and saw enough contracts, so I immediately doubled that to $20 billion. I haven't looked at a single thing they're planning, and that's probably not enough. And if you want to talk to a red state congressman about funding this thing and watch them squirm, you need to see mine. Who would be in that district? It's not going to happen on federal funds, so it's probably not going to happen at all because we in this country are really glad to have stuff built as long as somebody else pays for it. Folks need to look in the mirror if they want something bad enough and say, am I willing to pay for it? They're not. It's not going to happen. And it should, because we're not going to do all the other things. So anyway, on a lighter note, I can't imagine the profession as it exists today. Back when I graduated from A&M, and I really studied it all. It's great. I think most of what's happened is great. There's always bumps along the road, but that's kind of what makes life interesting, don't you think? And the rate things are changing is mind-boggling. The changes are going faster, and it's hard to keep up with a lot of them. Look at the technology involved in the social media world and how fast that changes, and how to adapt from that when you're used to doing things in a planned, coordinated, take your time, do it right manner. It's kind of hard to do. And I don't think you can imagine what the profession will look like when you're my age. But there's a couple things that I know for sure that'll work on your road down the path of the career. Sometimes you'll have a handle on the situation. Sometimes the situation will have a handle on you. Enjoy the journey, folks. Thanks for putting up with me for an hour and 10 minutes. I'm on Janice's nickel. By the way, if any big guy tells you they can't fit in the Yaris, it's the cheapest car you can get out here. I can fit in it with my golf gloves. Thanks, Bob.
Questions? Oh, come on, I know someone has a question.
What do you think about the theory that storm surge actually helps intensify the storm? Like it sprays particles into the air and helps with convection.
It's not the storm surge, it's the waves. And that is exactly right. There's an oceanographer at the University of Miami that has an experiment that's flown on the NOAA P3 trying to study, get better. We have the I can't even remember the acronym anymore, but one of the devices that hangs off the plane actually uses the movement and size of the droplets to estimate the speed of the wind now. And now they take that and they have basically know how much is in the air. They take the heat content of that. He's trying to work out what's the equation that relates how much is transferred from the ocean to the atmosphere. So the people actually, that is a very predominant theory. That's why I think you see a very quick progression when everything else is right. Nominally, you don't see an eye wall until you get to hurricane strength. And it struggles a lot in that early development phase. But from the point you get an eye wall and hurricane strength winds, if everything else is right, the progression of intensification is fairly dramatic. It goes pretty quickly. And that's one of the thought process. It's right at about 65 or 70 knots where the waves are large enough and the wind is strong enough that it pulls the spray off in these tendrils out there. You get a lot more spray in the air. It's really beautiful at 100 knots. The whole surface of the ocean turns white. And you go up to the cockpit of the plane, and you're trying to fly into the center of the storm, but you're having to fly at about a 45-degree angle and crab in with the 100-knot winds pushing sideways on that. And it generates rolls. There's these like gravity wave-like rolls. So the plane's doing this all the way, and you're going in, and you're doing this all the way. I think the anxiety, the grilled cheese sandwich, and those rolls is what did it. Other questions?
So you don't think people will react any different now than they did 30 years ago when there was a hurricane coming? I mean, they were still going to stay at home and watch TV?
I don't know. But we have a lot of great anecdotal stories from Hurricane Carla. And back then, about 20% that were ordered to leave stayed. And they say the same kind of statements. I've been here for hurricanes before, and I'll be here for them again. I'm staying. One of the interesting things that I'm not sure I totally agree with is that there's a desire to leave just for the possibility of not having electricity for a week. And the people that evacuate where they really don't have to. Oh my God, I'm not going to have my TV for a week. I'm out of here. I don't know people that would admit to that if it really is a cause.
Do you think it's going to happen again where, I mean, all of Houston's going to evacuate when they really didn't need to? I mean, is that problem been solved, you think?
It involves people, and you said forever, so I would never put it that far. But in the near future, well, as long as it's in the collective memory of leadership and they've got the right messaging, they really do. They have a great way of showing who should go and who shouldn't go, and they actually have a better way of locking down the freeway so that you're trapped if you live north of Interstate 10. You ain't going nowhere. You're not going to get on the freeway. So at the time of Rita, no one was telling them. There was no education on who should stay. We were all always worried about the people that should leave not leaving. So that's what the focus was. No one had ever seen a shadow evacuations. Were predicted to be in the evacuation guide is 10%. So we had 250%. There were 2,500,000 people between Beaumont, Port Arthur, and Houston who fled the storm, and there was about 900,000 that should have. Yes?
Well, it's more of a curiosity question, but at the Hurricane Center, when Ike was forming, because I'm from Houston, so I went back and I did some research on Ike. When it was out in the Central Atlantic, it was supposed to go to fish storm. The 5-day map had going out, near the East Coast, and it kept going, west, and it was going to Florida, and Mississippi, and Alabama, and it kept shifting west. How was it in the Hurricane Center office when they kept just going west, and was it going to Agala, kept seeing it?
When they're in the deep tropical flow, deep easterly flow going underneath a subtropical high, if it's going to be a bias, it's going to be that they turn them too fast to the north, and that's the reason I think someone needs to study the subtropical highs, because there's nothing else that's steering them at that point. And even though we account for it, and our error was less than those at the end days, you don't totally disregard, especially when the big global models like the GFS and European are also doing that. Hindsight would have been a little bit bolder initially, but then it got in the Gulf, it flip-flopped on us and erred the other way. That's the problem with it. It's not 100%. These biases are occasional. Yes?
When you had the list of places which might be more at risk for big events and not knowing what to do, you had listed southern New England. And in the case of things like Irene, just what are your takes on even if certain storms moved or how things track up there that might be different in the cases of per se the Gulf more?
Yeah, the New England storms require, the biggest area you're worried about in New England is catching the acceleration northward. Almost every storm that's hit New England Irene was going slow by New England standards, going 20 knots. No storm has hit Houston or New Orleans at 20 knots. So the error could be just as much left or right. The error, when you plot out all the errors, it's more oval, more elongated because of the timing function. The other problem with New England storms is, in fact, I had 4 of them while I was there. They parallel the coast. If they're far enough east when they start recurving, the skill is pretty good at saying, it's going to get within 120 miles, no closer. And they wait and watch it. But I think Earl was one that it was inside our window of uncertainty, and we couldn't say that even though it did. What you're looking for there is the timing of the low and the westerlies interacting with the hurricane coming out of the deep tropics. And the models are actually pretty good at that. The other part that's hard to forecast is the weakening trend, going extratropical or weakening. A big one like the 38 storm that takes in all of this. And the Connecticut coastline is really vulnerable because they've let people build all these fancy houses right down to the water's edge on Long Island Sound. Irene did all kinds of damage. In Fairfield, I think it was.
Yeah.
Big houses, $1 million pads in water. I don't know if they knew that now. Rhode Island's put up flood walls for Providence, and it's a rocky and steep coast, so there's less of a threat in there. But again, what is there is incredibly high-end property. And Boston's got some real issues if one comes in there strong enough, trapping the water in the Massachusetts Bay. Buzzards Bay is the big one. Buzzards Bay goes to 25 feet with a Category 3 hurricane coming up over Rhode Island. And there's a lot of stuff on Buzzards Bay, including these ancient old 2-lane evacuation roads off Cape Cod. The only 2.
Other questions?
Okay, folks, thanks a lot. The food was great.